had everything a man could want: the voice, the spotlight, the world leaning in to catch every note he sang. Dean Martin was the kind of star that made America forget its troubles for 3 minutes at a time. But on a cold February night in 1960, in a hotel room in West Virginia where the wallpaper peeled at the corners and the radiator clanked like a prisoner rattling his chains, Dean Martin sat alone with a telephone in his hand and wished he'd never learned to sing at all. The call had come at 2:47 in the morning. He knew who it was before he answered. There are some voices you recognize even through static, even through silence. Sam Giancana didn't introduce himself. He never had to. "Dean," he said. Just that, just his name, stretched out like a man pulling on a rope to see how much weight it could hold. Dean pressed the receiver against his ear and watched the snow falling past the window. Fat flakes, the kind that stuck to everything. He thought about his father back in Steubenville, how the old man used to say that snow in February meant someone was trying to bury something before spring came. "I'm listening," Dean said. And that's when Sam Giancana reminded him of a favor. Not the favor itself, not yet. Just that it existed. That it had been waiting, patient as a debt collector for exactly this moment. Dean tilted his lighter open, closed it, open. The snow kept falling. Somewhere down the hall, a man coughed. A door slammed. The radiator hissed like it was trying to warn him. "West Virginia's a hard state," Giancana said, his voice smooth as bourbon poured over ice that hadn't cracked yet. "People here don't trust easy, but they trust you, Dean. They trust that voice." Dean didn't ask what he was supposed to do. He already knew. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know until years later, until the weight of it had already pressed him into a shape he didn't recognize, was that some favors don't end when you pay them back. Some favors just teach you how to owe. West Virginia in 1960 was a state built on coal dust and broken promises. The mines ran deep. The winters ran long. The men who worked there had hands like sandpaper and eyes that looked past you, searching for something that mining towns never gave back. It was the kind of place where a Catholic running for president was about as welcome as a tax collector at a funeral. But John F. Kennedy needed West Virginia. And John F. Kennedy had friends who knew how to ask for help without asking. Dean had met Jack exactly twice. Once at a party in Palm Springs where the women wore dresses that cost more than his father made in a year, and once backstage at the Sands when Jack had leaned in close, smelling like expensive cologne and old money, and told him that Sinatra spoke highly of him. Frank. It always came back to Frank. Dean sat in the back of a campaign car, watching the hills roll past like waves frozen mid-crash. His driver was a local volunteer, a man named Earl, who chewed tobacco and spit into a Folgers can wedged between his boots. Earl didn't talk much, which Dean appreciated. Silence was a currency Dean understood better than most. They passed a church with broken windows, a general store with a Coca-Cola sign rusted to the color of dried blood, a woman standing in her yard, hanging laundry in weather cold enough to freeze it stiff before it dried. "People here don't forget," Earl said, breaking an hour of quiet. "They remember who showed up, and they remember who didn't." Dean nodded. He understood. Showing up was half the battle. The other half was making people believe you cared. He was good at that. Maybe too good. That night at a union hall that smelled like cigarettes and sweat and decades of men making promises they couldn't keep, Dean stood on a makeshift stage and sang "Ain't That a Kick in the Head." The crowd loved it. They clapped. They laughed. They forgot, just for a moment, that their backs hurt and their lungs were filling with coal dust and their children were leaving for cities that didn't want them either. Dean smiled. He always smiled. But backstage, in a corner where the light didn't quite reach, there was a man in a dark suit who didn't clap. He just watched, arms crossed, face unreadable. Dean had seen him before. Once in Chicago, once in Miami, once in a photograph that Frank had burned before Dean could ask why. The man nodded. Dean nodded back. And just like that, the performance within the performance began. Over the next 3 weeks, Dean crisscrossed West Virginia like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. He sang in union halls and high school gymnasiums and VFW posts that still had pictures of Eisenhower on the wall. He shook hands until his palm ached. He signed autographs on napkins, on shirt cuffs, on the backs of campaign flyers that said Kennedy for president, in letters bold enough to be seen from the road. And everywhere he went, people asked him the same question. You really think he can win? Dean always said yes. What he didn't say was that winning wasn't the point. The point was the favor. The point was that when Sam Giancana called, you answered. When he asked, you delivered. And when it was done, you didn't ask what came next. You just waited. One night, after a rally in Charleston where the crowd had been twice the size the organizers expected, Dean sat in his hotel room and poured himself a scotch. He didn't drink it right away. He just held the glass and watched the ice shift and settle, the way continents must have looked when the world was still deciding what shape it wanted to be. There was a knock at the door. Dean didn't move. Another knock. Softer this time. He set the glass down and opened the door to find a man he'd never seen before. Young, thin, wearing a coat too big for his frame. Mr. Martin, the man said, I'm supposed to give you this. He handed Dean an envelope. No name, no return address. Just the weight of paper that felt heavier than it should. Dean opened it. Inside was a single sheet with an address in McDowell County and a time, 11 p.m. Nothing else. The young man was already walking away. Hey, Dean called after him. Who sent you? The man stopped, turned, looked at Dean with eyes that had seen too much for someone barely old enough to vote. Does it matter? He said, and then he was gone. Dean stood in the doorway, holding the envelope, feeling the cold air from the hallway creep into the room like something that had been waiting for permission. He closed the door, locked it, poured another scotch. This time he drank it. The address led to a house on the edge of a town so small it didn't have a name, just a number on a county road map. The house was dark except for a single light in the kitchen window. Dean parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, his breath hanging in the air like smoke signals no one was coming to read. He knocked. The door opened immediately, as if someone had been standing there waiting. Sam Giancana looked older than Dean remembered. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His hair was thinner, but his smile, that smile that never quite reached his eyes, was exactly the same. Dean, he said, stepping aside. Come in. It's cold. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and something else, something metallic. Dean didn't ask. They sat at a small table in the kitchen. Giancana poured 2 cups of coffee, didn't offer sugar, didn't offer cream, just black coffee in white mugs that looked like they belonged in a diner, not a house in the middle of nowhere. You've been doing good work, Giancana said. I've been singing. That's what I said. Dean wrapped his hands around the mug. The heat felt good, real. Jack's gonna win West Virginia, Giancana continued. And when he does, people are gonna remember who helped him, people like you. I didn't do it for Jack. Giancana smiled. I know. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame. There's something you should know, Giancana said, his voice dropping to a register Dean had only heard once before, in a nightclub in Chicago, when a man had insulted Frank and Giancana had leaned over and whispered something that made the man leave so fast he forgot his coat. I'm listening. This favor? Giancana tapped the table with one finger. It's not over when Jack wins. It's not over when he gets to the White House. It's not over until I say it's over. Dean looked at him, really looked, and saw for the first time the thing he'd been trying not to see since the phone rang in February. This wasn't a favor. This was a leash. Understood, Dean said. Giancana stood, extended his hand. Dean shook it. The older man's grip was cold despite the coffee. Frank speaks highly of you, Giancana said as he walked Dean to the door. Says you're smart. Says you know how to keep your mouth shut. Frank talks too much. Giancana laughed. A short, sharp sound. That's why I like you, Dean. You know the value of silence. Dean stepped out into the cold. Behind him, the door closed. The light in the kitchen window went out. And Dean Martin walked back to his car, knowing that he'd just signed something he couldn't read in a language he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Kennedy won West Virginia by a margin that surprised everyone except the men who'd made sure he would. Dean watched the results come in from a hotel room in Los Angeles, 3,000 miles away from the coal dust and the union halls and the house with the kitchen light. Frank called. We did it, Pally. he shouted over the sound of celebration in the background. They said it couldn't be done. They said a Catholic couldn't win. But we showed 'em. Dean held the phone away from his ear. Yeah, he said. We showed 'em. You coming to the party? I'm tired, Frank. You're always tired. Yeah. Frank's voice softened. Just a fraction. Just enough for Dean to hear the question underneath the celebration. You okay, Dean?
I'm fine.
You sure? I'm sure. Frank didn't push. He never did. That was the unspoken rule between them. You could ask once, but if the door stayed closed, you walked away. All right, Pally, get some rest. We got a lot more work to do. The line went dead. Dean sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the phone. Outside, Los Angeles glittered like a city made of promises it had no intention of keeping. Cars honked. Somewhere, a woman laughed. Somewhere else, a siren wailed. Dean set the phone down. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, stretched beneath him like a map of everywhere he'd been, and nowhere he wanted to go. He thought about his father, about Steubenville, about the way the old man used to come home from the mill with his hands so black with coal dust that it took 3 washes before you could see skin again. Stay out of trouble, his father had told him once. Trouble's easy to find and hard to lose. Dean pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He'd found it, all right. And it had found him. The months after West Virginia moved like a dream someone else was having. Kennedy became president. Frank became a fixture at the White House, or as close to it as a man like Frank could get. The Rat Pack ruled Vegas like kings in a desert kingdom, where the only law was the one you made yourself. And Dean kept singing. He sang at the Sands. He sang on television. He sang for presidents and gangsters and everyone in between who couldn't tell the difference anymore. But there were nights, quiet nights, when the show was over, and the applause had faded, and the dressing room was empty except for the smell of smoke and the ghost of a crowd that had already forgotten him, when Dean would sit alone and think about that kitchen in West Virginia, about the coffee, about Giancana's smile, about the handshake that felt like a contract written in invisible ink. A stagehand who worked the Sands during those years later said he'd seen Dean sitting in his dressing room long after everyone else had gone home, just staring at himself in the mirror, not fixing his hair, not straightening his tie, just staring, like he was trying to figure out who the hell was staring back. The stagehand said. One night in 1963, Dean was backstage at the Sands when a man in a suit approached him. Not Sam Giancana, someone else. Someone Dean had never seen before but recognized anyway by the way he carried himself. By the weight of authority that didn't need a badge. Mr. Martin, the man said. I'm with the Bureau. I'd like to ask you a few questions. Dean looked at him. I don't have any answers. I haven't asked the questions yet. Doesn't matter. The man smiled. It wasn't friendly. We know about West Virginia, he said quietly. We know about the calls, the meetings, the envelope. Dean's face didn't change. I was campaigning for a friend. Is that what you call it? That's what I call it. They stood there, 2 men in a hallway that smelled like beer and broken dreams, neither one willing to blink first. Finally, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. If you remember anything, he said, placing it on the table beside Dean, give me a call. Dean looked at the card. Didn't touch it. I won't remember anything. People usually don't, until they do. The man walked away. Dean waited until he was gone, then picked up the card and tore it into pieces small enough to disappear. But the words stayed. They always did. That same week, Frank called. They're asking questions, Dean. I know. What'd you tell them? Nothing. Good. Keep it that way. I always do. Frank was quiet for a moment. This thing we did. We didn't do anything, Frank. Dean. We sang some songs. We shook some hands. That's all. Frank exhaled. Yeah, he said, that's all. But they both knew it wasn't. And they both knew that knowing was a weight you carried until it broke you, or you broke it. Dean chose silence. It was the only choice that made sense. Because in the world he lived in, the world of favors and handshakes and phone calls at 2:47 in the morning, talking was the most dangerous thing a man could do. The favor followed Dean Martin for the rest of his life. Not in obvious ways. Not with more phone calls or more envelopes or more kitchens in houses that didn't exist on any map. It followed him in the way all debts do, quietly, patiently, like a shadow that only appears when the light hits just right. When Sam Giancana was murdered in 1975, shot 7 times in his own basement while frying sausages in his kitchen, reporters called Frank. They called Sammy. They called everyone who'd ever stood on a stage with a microphone and a secret, but they didn't call Dean. Because Dean had learned the most important lesson of all. If you want to survive in a world built on favors, you become invisible. You smile, you sing, and you never ever let them see you. Remember? Years later, a reporter asked Dean about his relationship with organized crime. Dean looked at him the way you'd look at a child asking why the sky was blue. "I sang songs," he said. "That's all I ever did. But the rumors are rumors." The reporter pressed. Dean stood up. "This interview's over." And it was. Because Dean Martin understood something that most people never learn. The truth doesn't set you free. Silence does. He never spoke about West Virginia. Never spoke about the envelope or the kitchen or the handshake that sealed a contract he couldn't break. He carried it the way miners carry coal dust in their lungs. Invisible, permanent, slowly suffocating. When Dean died on Christmas morning in 1995, there were obituaries in every major newspaper. They talked about his voice, his movies, his television show, his place in the Rat Pack, but they didn't talk about West Virginia. They didn't talk about the favor. And they didn't talk about the night Sam Giancana called. And Dean Martin answered, because some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be carried. In the quiet spaces between songs, in the silence after the applause, in the weight of a telephone that rang once, at 2:47 in the morning, and changed everything. A bartender at the Sands who worked there in the 60s remembered something Dean said once, late one night after the last customer had stumbled home. "You ever feel like you're singing someone else's song?" Dean had asked, staring into his scotch like it held the answer. The bartender didn't know what to say. Dean smiled. That same smile that made America love him. "Me neither," he said. And then he finished his drink and walked out into the desert night, where the stars were bright and the debts were invisible, and the only sound was the wind carrying secrets across sand that would never repeat them. Some nights stay with you, not because of the music, but because of what you paid to play it.